Hello and welcome to episode 27 of Ears for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking today to Stefanie Rhodes, director of the London-based architectural practice Gatty Rowth Rhodes, about her journey to and through architecture, her design process and practice, and the everyday reality of being a really good architect.
I think one of the things that is really important about our practice is that the designs emerge very much out of conversation and argument and experiment, and we build models, and well, Richard and Tom build models. I don't so much. I do drawings, and we sort of all design in quite a different way, and that sort of complements really well. And you do sort of research on the materials and on the references, and you have discussions, and you sort of bash this thing about. You really push and pull and push and pull, and then try things out and do something else and do it again, and sort of move it around and present it to the client and talk about it and present it at consultation. And it's sort of it's malleable. It's something that forms, that emerges slowly, that sort of peels away to become what it then is, and where it sort of starts feeling like there is no other way that it could be, in a way.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to Ears for Architecture. I'm talking today to Stefanie Rhodes. Stefanie, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Hi, Ambrose. So I'm Stefanie Rhodes, and I'm director at Gatty Rowth Rhodes, which Richard Gatty, Tom Rowth, and I founded in 2013. So it's a small architectural practice. I've also worked in larger practice, studied in Sheffield and at London Met, and I've done some teaching. I'm currently also an external advisor to the ARB, so that's roughly where I'm at and what I do.
Let's start with that last one. What's an external advisor to ARB?
An external advisor to ARB, that sort of comes out. I used to do RIBA validation panels, which I started as a student, which is visiting schools of architecture and reviewing the documentation for the ARB, for the RIBA. And from that, I quite enjoyed that. I quite enjoy the teaching aspect of architecture. I mean, as long as I don't have to be responsible for anything longer term. What I do for the ARB is more desktop based. So actually, it's far less exciting in a way than the RIBA validation panels, where you actually get to see student work and you get to speak to tutors and you get to speak to students at that particular school of architecture. It's far more desktop based, and you look at how the descriptions and documentation provided by courses match up with the sort of requirement to deliver the ARB criteria. So it's actually quite a dry job. But I also quite enjoy getting into that level of detail and really sort of cross-referencing about 8 different PDFs and trying to figure out exactly where there might be holes or there might not be, or where there could be in sort of various scenarios that you run through. So it's sort of a very paper-based and dry version of, I guess, what you do in a design process to a certain extent. And I quite enjoy it.
So you were at Sheffield, you did both parts at Sheffield, and then you moved into practice down in London. I'm kind of interested in this journey that you took. So I don't know it fully, but
No, I only did my part 1 in Sheffield and my part 2 at London Met. But actually, I didn't know anything about architecture when I decided to study it, because I grew up in Germany, and you do your A levels, and there just wasn't really any careers advice or anything like that, and I just quite enjoyed. I did maths and art as A levels, but you do lots of other subjects. Quite enjoyed those 2 subjects, and then it was like the sort of cliche of what you can do with that. Oh, of course you can do architecture. And my father's British, and I grew up speaking English. So there was this option to try out studying in the UK on that sort of sense. I literally just got the good university guide and applied to the universities. That's all that's all I had. And because I was applying from abroad, I didn't even need to turn up for interview or have a look at the universities. I just didn't know anything about it. I literally just pressed a couple of buttons and well, not even that. You had to do it on paper at that point, wasn't it? So I sent it all off, got a place at some point, and then turned up in Sheffield and was sort of, from the small little market town that had sort of been restored out of an inch of his life, like driving down the motorway towards Sheffield. Like, what have I done? But architecture was entirely different from what I imagined. I mean, I turned up to the first day having sort of not read any of the documentation. I didn't have a pen on me. I didn't have anything on me. I just turned up. And when they asked us then to draw something, whatever it was, and that I just, I didn't even realize that was something you had to do. But it then turned out to be far more exciting than I could have imagined it to be, and I really, was incredibly lucky in that sense, because it just fitted. I just really enjoyed it.
And Sheffield at that time, I don't know what it is now. I probably should, being an educator. I'm guessing it's probably the same. Sustainability and social justice, really. Well, it's
very much. Yeah, I was very much exploration. I was very lucky. Ruth Morrow, who was head of first year at that point, very much made a point that she wanted to do the first year differently. She wanted to run it as a sort of feminist, it was like Jeremy Tiller's approach of it being a feminist school of architecture, and she wanted to run it differently. So she gave us a talk right at the beginning that I still remember, saying, you can do this work between 9 and 6, and you leave at 6 and you come at 9, and we don't support this sort of working culture that is incredibly detrimental to architectural education and actually also architecture work. And that there was a lot of exploration and a lot of sort of overlap, looking at what architecture actually does and can enable, rather than what it formally looks like, and and the sort of dry theoretical framework that is somehow translated into a proposal. It's very much that sort of experiential, explorative, and that was probably what was different from what I expected, right? Because I hadn't come across that. I did my year out in London in architectural practice. That's quite a lot of housing. I was sort of thrown into that.
Which one was that?
That was Levitt Bernstein at Levitt Bernstein.
Again, but a very socially orientated practice as well, and with quite a lot of participatory work as well. So that is interesting.
Yeah, I wasn't really involved with that bit when I was there. I did a lot of sort of drawing work, but that was a really good way of learning that and getting to grips with that, because that was probably something I didn't have that much experience of, because I was all about doing the collage and whatnot. And after that, I sort of had enough of I can take another year and do something else, and ended up first working on a building site in France for a bit, and I traveled a lot in the next year, and I was lucky that there was European funding available for that work on a building site, so that allowed me quite a lot of freedom. It was a Leonardo da Vinci program, and then I worked for Dina Petrescu from Sheffield in Paris for 4 months, which again was a very socially motivated practice. They're called their architecture office Atelier de Architecture Autogérée. So self-generated, sort of grassroots up architecture, where they worked in quite a impoverished neighborhood on a community garden. And I was doing a lot of the graphics work to sort of see what had happened, to analyze what had happened over the previous years. And it's this whole experience of this sort of very socially engaged and very grassroots up and incredibly low paid in a way. I mean, not that any one of the people that I work for, but like, it's very difficult to make that kind of work economically viable without, you to a certain extent have to rely on sort of arts-based or grant funding or sort of other sources of income that are not necessarily architectural. It doesn't work via fees and all of that. And I was really interested in that, but also I sort of at the end of those 2 years, I sort of craved, in a way, a structure and the more traditional approach in a way. I went to London Met, which again probably I guess sort of offers both, but actually when I was there, I continued down that sort of more socially engaged, less traditional architectural approach. And it's a really difficult one because I think I didn't have a lot of self-confidence in sort of the inner design ability, and working in that. So first also on the India, you go the Architecture of Rapid Change and Scarce Resources unit, and then free unit with Robert Mull. It never was about that. It was less about the actual design as about the sort of story about it and how you created it. Wasn't there was something that was that I don't know quite how to put that. It didn't help me gain more confidence in terms of actually building things and getting things done.
So do you think like you had become kind of, I know what you mean, by the way. I know what you mean. And I've been kind of encountering this a lot recently in our architecture students, but also in myself, because I bought a really buggered up house and then thought, well, I'm a big, strong lad. I can sort this out. And I've studied architecture for years, and then presented with it. I've actually found myself very removed from this practice. Is actually learning how to do the simplest thing, like drill a hole straight. That kind of stuff has actually become really removed. So you've got this kind of education. You're describing this kind of educational system, particularly, I mean, all the way across, or educational experience, which is extremely rich. I mean, fantastic schools you've gone to and practices you work for, and Doina Petrescu and whatnot in Paris, but then there's always this. Am I right in thinking that there's this kind of nagging feeling that you don't know how to do stuff?
In a way, and it was bizarre because actually I had worked on, I had spent sort of 4 months on a building site, and I can do an ACE sort of traditional sort of concrete floor and whatnot, that with a sort of smooth finish and all of that by hand. So it's not that I probably had actually more experience of that than some of the people I studied with, and I still felt entirely intimidated by all these, by these sort of mainly dudes standing up and sort of being quite bolshy about knowing everything and knowing how things are built and how things are made and how things are put together and how you manage a site and how you do stuff. And I sort of felt like a lot of this, which is actually in a way a lot harder, this sort of practice that is sort of more research based and art based and participatory and trying to sort of go bottom up. It sort of felt I hadn't quite equipped me with this ability to deal with this attitude that I encountered or I felt. I mean, maybe I'm not doing people justice. I think this was also about myself, but it's
no, I think
I just found that difficult.
I don't think that's an unreasonable critique. I think most architecture students could reasonably say that their architectural education had not equipped them for the kind of cut and thrust of the site, but also possibly not for the nature of orthodox practice. And that's not to say kind of boring hegemonic practice. It's just practice as practice. Like, how do you get, if you want to build a house in South London, there are certain things you need to know how to do. Practice, perhaps conceptual practice as we do it, perhaps isn't the best tool for doing that.
I don't think it is. I agree with that, but I also think it's not so much about knowing how to do it. It's about a lot of people that you think know how to do that don't know it either. And there is so much hot air in architectural practice, and it's so easy to sort of forget that everyone in a certain way is in the same boat, and it's all about being able to find things out and being confident in the way that you can find things out and you can get to that, and that that approach is entirely valid. That that it's not about sort of being, this sort of flustered up, hot air spewing approach. That is the thing that is actually really the problem, and that I found
Well,
like measuring up against
it's
difficult.
hubris. Yeah, it's hubris, isn't it? There's a lot of hubris in architecture. That attitude of performativity is the word that's kind of chucked around in sociology. Like, you've got to be the architect, and to be the architect, you have to wear the right clothes and say the right things and have the right attitude and not get intimidated by, well, you go onto a building site and everybody there knows more about it than you do.
But you know what? The building sites I've never actually never had a problem with. So, I mean, maybe I've just been very lucky, but mostly, I mean, not always, but generally, the builders I've come across have been incredibly collaborative, been absolutely fine to explain things if you ask the questions. I'm actually quite happy to explain things once that someone actually wants to know how things work, and have been good to work with on that level. I think that the problem is sort of more the middle management is the wrong word, but it's that it's sort of the architectural culture in sometimes, and that you have to present as if you know everything, and that most of the times, like, sort of another example, most of the time I've sort of got to a point where I don't care if someone thinks that my questions are stupid or not. I absolutely don't care, because actually there's lots of people asking stupid questions, and I might as well ask one as well, but there's a chance that it's not stupid, and just live with it. I don't care anymore if someone else thinks they're stupid, but that's something that you sort of have to learn, and I don't think that's necessarily always encouraged. I mean, architecture as well talks a lot about, it's all about exploration, it's all about this, that, and other. But I still think there's sometimes the sort of thing that don't ask lots of questions and explore, but not the wrong ones, not in the wrong way, not in this. You have to do it in a way that fits in. You have to do it in a way that is a certain has got a certain polish or a certain sheen.
Yeah.
And I think that's I just don't care anymore.
So. No, I think it's. I mean, so you're kind of stuck as an architect, certainly of the kind you describe, between either being some kind of gentlewoman philosopher, or you're some kind of shiny-shoed, sharp-suited operator, and you seem to me to be suggesting that you may have preferred a role that was slightly more artisanal, slightly more to do with the nature of architecture, as you say, as collaborative, as co-productive, and perhaps more hand-wrought in a kind of way, more something to do with.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really important about our practice, like
about Gatti,
Tom and Richard and I, is that we, the designs emerge very much out of conversation and argument and experiment, and we build models, and well, Richard and Tom build models. I don't so much. I do drawings, and we sort of all design in quite a different way, and that sort of complements really well. And you do the sort of research on the materials and on the references, and you have discussions, and you sort of bash this thing about, you really push and pull and push and pull, and then try things out and do something else and do it again, and sort of move it around and present it to the client and talk about it and present it at consultation. And it's sort of it's malleable. It's something that forms, that emerges slowly, that sort of peels away to become what it then is, and where it sort of starts feeling like there is no other way that it could be, in a way. it's not so much a there are philosophical discussions about whether things work this way and that, and they inform that design process. But for me, it really is about the thing. It's about the object and what it does. And I guess that sort of goes back to that, being interested in about what architecture does and not so much what it looks like. Although I am also, I think that there's an importance in buildings and spaces being beautiful, however that may be defined. And I think there's a huge range of that definition. But that's the sort of thing I enjoy about practice, and drawing in these other people, engineers, the landscape, the this client, the
Planners.
residents, if it's about housing.
The planners. Don't forget the planners.
Well, I think the planning is really a difficult one, because it shouldn't be, but it depends so much on the individual planners that you deal with. And we've worked with like Bethnal Green Mission Church. There was a very, very good planner throughout, up until we then submitted, and it was very good, and really was also very good at negotiating and very good at dealing with these sort of different pressures that came through that project. On other projects we've worked with, we've equally had good planners, but we've also had some where it's very difficult to understand where they're coming from and why certain things are being insisted on, even if they don't make any sense, and they will make even less sense in the next few years in terms of climate change. And I don't want to have a discussion about having to add more parking in a London borough when when we're already providing like what I think is far too much parking. It's not even not providing any, it's just like supposedly not enough, not like 3 cars per what. And it's just like so there's, but it's again it's very much that negotiation that is actually so it starts creating that proposal, and you're sort of there to help it emerge in a way. Don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think it does. I think it's really interesting because also, I mean, one of the peculiarities of the way that we learn architecture, because I'm kind of interested in your motivations and how your practice is motivated, and how the background story to your learning about architecture has influenced the way that you operate. And what's interesting is that you're describing, I think, although the rhetoric around your education is about collaboration and feminism and whatever it is, but certainly anti-hierarchical social political philosophies, what you do in architecture studio, in architecture school, is always kind of sole authored monoliths. It's like that's what we teach people. And then you're talking about how in practice you've developed this collaborative model that is genuinely collaborative, polyphonic, you might say, creating multi-voiced pieces. And I thought that was just a very elegant way of describing how you do it, how you take this thing and then you kind of like basically scrape away at it until you've all kind of found the object that sits comfortably within your...
Yeah, I mean, it becomes a compromise, but a compromise that is better than it would have been if every single, if any single voice had sort of pushed their way through with force. And it's sort of orchestrating that compromise that is really interesting. But it's also, I mean, I think the one thing that you don't learn in architecture school is that this sort of design process is like 10% of what you do. Like the rest of the time is actually this, it's also design, but it's a design process of how to make things happen, of sort of if you're working on smaller sites, of the issues on site, if you're working on larger projects, and then it's about the codes and compliance and lead times and how that affects costs, and it's there's a creativity in that I sort of had to discover for myself that I didn't really come across that much in architectural education. And I think I mean, talk about also about the sort of self-esteem or whatnot. I was very lucky that I also ended up working in the projects office at London Met, which was not so much architecture based, but I had a fantastic boss who was really good at project management. So that was something I sort of learned from her. And in South Korea, where things just get built just like that, just really, really fast, which is I'd never built anything
that
before.
was through the architecture research unit, was it?
It sort of was. There was a collaboration between the Korea National University of Arts, the school and the School of Architecture, about sort of running a joint course, like a sort of diploma unit, and that happened. And I went out there for 3 months to support that. But then I just stayed for an entire year and had just worked in an architecture office there.
Yeah, that's amazing. I lived in Seoul for a while as well.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. Extraordinary place.
And but it was also that sort of gave me actually being there and then suddenly having to produce like huge amounts of drawings and sort of, I mean, the working culture is punishing in a way, but there was also a huge amount of other things that work very differently and that new are far more nuanced than the sort of image you get of the working culture, and far more supportive. And it just meant that I could come back to the UK in 2010, so 2 years after. Actually, I came back in 2011, but 3 years after a major economic crisis that completely wrecked architectural education, and everyone I knew had sort of become unemployed. With suddenly I had a portfolio of drawings that looked plausible, that were going to be built, that had sort of pushed me through that. That actually, the full picture of a sort of more commercial, more traditional set, I'd sort of compressed that into that year. That then allowed me to get a job with Karakusevich Carson and sort of get thrown into the housing deep end in that practice. And that then, those 3 years then allowed me to get to a point where I felt there was I had something that would allow me to set up practice with Richard and Tom, that sort of skill of that maneuvering, that sort of more traditional world. Because I do think it's important to be able to do that and to understand the sort of economic realities of that and how it works. And I was very lucky to work at KCA for that time, because it was incredibly exciting. We were working on big projects, and that was still very much sort of resident driven.
That's really interesting. You talked a bit about how your design has, I suppose, in a way, bounced off your education. Your education, almost the way that you describe it, your not education, training, almost seems to me to be a counterpoint, a formative counterpoint to how you've actually ended up practicing. Is that fair, or is that a complete misrepresentation? I'm very used to, by the way, doing complete misrepresentations of people. It's my strongest skill.
I think it's sort of in part. I think the solo design and sort of even sitting at home designing things. I mean, it's that is completely in contrast to how I work as a designer, and quite a lot, and with design in the widest sense, even in terms of how I put documents together, how I write, and a lot of my confidence I gained as a designer or not came actually out of practice, and possibly even sort of the more traditional practice in a way. But I would still say that the sort of more participatory and non-traditional practice is what has shaped what I'm interested in to a certain extent, and is something I go back to now again. It sort of come full circle to a certain extent, but I feel I had to go through and be able to do these other things, and
I think,
before
well,
I can actually make good use of that and actually, also see it slightly more critical. The sort of need. I think the economics are a real issue, because one of the reasons I work as an architect is because I want to earn a salary, and I want to have a pension, and I want to have a decent quality of life. It's not. I'm not. I don't think. There's a sort of thing about artists seeing themselves as these architects seeing themselves, for example, as artists, where and people see them like that. And why should we pay you to do things that you enjoy to do? And it's like, because this is bloody hard work, and because it's taken long enough to get the skills to do this, and because I want to have a salary, I want to be able to pay myself. So,
I mean, there's two things I want to pick up on what you said, because I think there's this really interesting idea about the production of documentation being a process of design, and I fully agree with that. I'm more and more convinced that design is the thing that differentiates us as a species. I think you can leave aside all the other things, but I think everything is design. And that's obviously because this idea of there's a creative activity at play in all of these, production of a design document might seem like the most boring thing in the world, but I think you're right. I think there is something designerly about it, and perhaps those educational experiences you had, certainly this is what I feel about my time at Sheffield, is it helped me understand the world through a designerly mentality, and even the production of social processes that might produce the need to produce architecture could be the subject of design thinking. And I found that I've always found that very rewarding. So even though I've not done much with my design education in terms of working as an active designer, productive designer, I've always found that kind of very rewarding. But there was this, so I'm kind of intrigued by that. But before we recorded, I asked you about COVID and this idea of working alone, working from home. And I wondered whether you could think about that and the idea of design practice, talk about that in design practice again, and make it sound fresh. Twice.
I'll do my best. No, it's like, no, I mean, I guess what I was saying was that I actually, the first bit of lockdown was just really hard, because I've got a small kid, and not having a nursery place, and my partner was also working full time, and actually, because we actually were busy, we were sort of trying to each get in a full working day while also looking after a kid at the same time, and making sure that all keeps going, and that didn't work very well. That was really hard, and I wasn't even homeschooling. That like, I don't even know how people survived that. But once nursery was up and running again, I became quite comfortable sort of working at home, and doing design discussions over Zoom, and having our drawings and sketching over Zoom and whatnot. And I was also was slightly paranoid about COVID and whatnot, so I was probably one of the last ones to be comfortable and sort of being back in the office. And it took me some time to sort of get back to it, and I sort of slipped into this comfort zone of working at home, sort of your own stew in a way, and that's exactly what it turned out to be. I mean, I sort of felt like I was being productive, and that was all going well. But once I was back in the office, and once we got back to this sort of more collaborative working, I really, it's just been such a relief, and it works so much better. And it's and yes, you can combine that with home working. You can combine that with doing certain things at home, because certain things do work better if you've got can have the focus and there aren't discussions going on in the background. But not, that's for short periods. That's for me at least, the office and working together and working with other people and popping by on the other side of the desk to look at something and sketch it out with someone with two pens on the paper at the same time, and arguing about something and then getting a book and looking it up or Googling something, or the third person sort of looking over the shoulder, or just even, with the people that work with us, being able to overhear some of the discussions on the phone, so knowing what's going on, being able to jump in and support someone on something, it just didn't work when all of us were working at home. And as I said, it doesn't mean that you can't be flexible and you can't work from home partially and whatnot, but the main driver is, for me, is that collaborative working environment. And even I think you can write some of the texts and whatnot that you need for your DNA statements or not, or for whatever competitions and whatnot, but then I personally need to discuss things again and put them visually on pages and start drawing that in again. And also I work better if I'm not stuck working on the same thing forever. So having different things to work on that I can jump between is really helpful. And that's very difficult because you just sort of stew in your own soup at home, don't you? You just you go down rabbit holes trying to perfect things, and it's very difficult to step outside of that. It's very difficult to step back because nobody's pulling you back. In the office, there's always a, you always have to. That's why it's a way the sort of focus sometimes works better at home, because there's always something else pulling you in the office. But actually, that is really productive.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? It's about this, the efficiency that one gets at home, because I felt this too. It's like I can power through a lot of work away from the distractions of the people that pay my wages, which are the students. I can get through a ton of work. I'm a bit slow in the mornings, but when I get into my running, I'm sort of unstoppable. And I'm not convinced much of it's that good. That there's a kind of, and I don't have to do much design work. I do most of my design work I give away for free to students on their tutorials, little darlings. But there's a kind of inefficiency to collective action, which is possibly how good quality collective action happens. Like collective design work, it's the kind of democratic principle, isn't it? Democracy is inefficient by design, and that's what's good about it. It's like it slows down.
It slows down. You have to think about things. You have to have discussion. You have to justify it. It's 6 of us in the office. I mean, generally, that's probably a bit much for a design review, whatever it is, at least 3. And there's different voices, and you have to justify, and you have to sort of build up that story and the logic behind it and fine tune it. And you suddenly, if you come to snags, you have to really sort of think about what is the problem? What is actually the essence here? What are you discussing? What are you trying to do? Why doesn't it work? And that's why I think a lot of this other work, the 90% that isn't this image of you sort of sitting there with a pen and doing a design work, but all of the other stuff on the
dream, you mean the dream?
Yeah, the dream, exactly. Is actually also design work, because that's exactly what you do. You sort of step back, you look at what's the problem, how can you solve? Is there a different way of looking at it? What happens if I drop one of the restrictions, or what's when I shift one of these parameters around? What happens at that point? And you really, it's a lot easier to do that in collaboration than it is by yourself, or to test it, to really test it, to really push it, because no single person can think of enough ways to test something thoroughly. So
no, I think you're right. And I think this whole, I mean, if everything's design, then all design is collaborative. And the bullshit idea that you've got, that you can do things. I mean, I liked teaching on Zoom. I got quite good at teaching on Teams. We were on Microsoft Teams.
Wow.
I know Zoom's cheap replica. But I was using like these digital sketch pads. I got quite good at it. It was quite good. I could get through the tutorial. I had a clock in the corner. It was 20 minutes. That's what they got. and I was efficient as hell, but I'm really not sure that they got the best of me, and certainly students didn't get the best design education. And so I'm kind of interested in this. So this kind of collaborative idea, but also this idea of slowness. There's a wonderful paper by an architect couple called Billy Sen and Todd Williams. They're based, I think, in New England somewhere, maybe in Philadelphia or maybe in New York. And it's called On Slowness. And it's a beautiful kind of rumination on the value of this process. I mean, they also talk about the use of things like drawing. Like you've mentioned this idea of getting around a piece of paper and like drawing out each other's ideas, and maybe it's getting around a screen, but there is a huge value in that activity. And I think we were blessed we were the kind of last moment in architectural education where drawing boards were normative. Like,
yeah, my undergrad was hand drawn.
Yeah. I mean, I went into a practice after, to be honest, and we still did a lot of hand drawing, but by the time I left, I was there 5 years, and by the time I left, it had all gone computerized, almost all of it. There was still a little bit of hand drawn stuff, but
I think, I don't think that's exclusive though, because I mean, we work in Revit from the outset, but it is, it's a tool like any other, and you have to just really get it to do what you want it to do. So it becomes more like a pen and less like something that sort of shoves you around and forces you to do things. And it sort of takes time to get it to that point, or to manage it at a certain level of experience. And I think that is the challenge in architectural education, that students do need to be up to speed, if at all possible, on these skills. It is of benefit to know these programs, but these programs are so good at getting them, getting you to do what they want rather than the other way around, and forcing you to look at things in the way that they want. That it's very difficult to sort of bridge that, because I think the sort of power over Revit and other tools like that to do what you want comes with experience, and comes with the skill of managing that program, and comes with design experience. And yeah, I'm not sure how that gap can be bridged. Sort of all of tutors that manage to do that and manage to teach that.
Your Bethnal Green Mission Church is a lovely piece of work. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know it is. It's a lovely piece of work. It's probably a significant piece of work in its quiet way, with a lovely, lovely roof. And I've used that roof, actually. I've used it in my teaching. And I just wanted to know about, I suppose, a little bit about what idea, it's sort of undeniable as a piece of space making, piece of architecture, piece of urban green. Was it underpinned by any significant, specific kind of ideas? I'm always interested in the ideas that underpin architecture. Or was it a very pragmatic kind of spatial solution to a kind of very pragmatic client? I mean, for goodness sake, it's a church. It's got to have some philosophy in it.
Well, first of all, our client wasn't that straightforward. So the client was actually a partnership between the developer and the church. So there were two different voices in that. Nevertheless, sort of what we generally do, and we work a lot with churches and sort of faith community groups, is we went through a process to sort of try to understand what sort of being a church meant to them. We talked to them. We used two different local examples for that. So Bethnal Green is very close to Christchurch, Spitalfields, Hawksmoor. Beautiful grand church, end of a avenue, and all about the views down the avenue and the sort of separateness and of God and the sort of power that comes with that and whatnot, and sort of awe. But it's also very close to what is now the Brick Lane Mosque, which was built around a couple of years later to the Hawksmoor Church. So it's built pretty much at the same time, and built very much as a part of the street. And it's got certain civic signifiers, pediments, but but it is part of that. There's a sort of urban continuity with it, and it was built as a mixed-use building, so it actually had weavers lofts. It sort of weavers studios under the loft, so you could get the light in. And we used those two examples of sort of ways that you can present, you can do church, you can understand yourself as a church, and the leadership of the church and the representation, they were very clear that they wanted that second one. They wanted to be part of the sort of urban form. They didn't want to stand separate of it. They didn't want to be a set piece. They wanted to be part of the urban block and the urban grain, and that's how they understood themselves as a community, and as how they understood their mission and their faith. So that was really, really helpful, and that sort of set the tone for us approaching the site in a way as a background architecture, even though it does have, it does have certain elements that set it apart from, if it were just, in quotation marks, a residential building. There is a clear community use at ground floor. There are certain elements that show that it is a church, but it doesn't stand apart, and it references sort of local architectural language, but it tries to sort of sit as background to that rather than as an object. And I mean, it's a difficult site because it's at the head of Paradise Gardens, listed park. It's got the grade 1 listed St John le Less and Bethnal Green next to it, the grade 2 star, I think the Museum of Childhood, conservation area. I mean, it was there was that as well. It needed to sit comfortably with all of those architectural gems and not try to, we didn't want it to shout in any way, but we wanted to be able to hold itself. So that was sort of how we approached it, I guess, from a sort of architectural language. But there's also then there were lots of different things that we needed to achieve within the brief. So it has to serve a lot of different activities. So the church undertakes, it needs to obviously have a worship space that needs to be at the heart of what the church wanted, or what the church is. But they also wanted to have a cafe that functions as an open door in a way, and that also allows them to keep the church open and have some income and make the church accessible and provide a sort of community hub. They do things like food bank, night shelters, homework clubs, youth work, and all of that also needed to somehow happen. They support charities, so there's also offices in the buildings where they rent out or allow charities to have office space. And the site itself was very compact for all of that. And on top of that, and none of that would have happened if it didn't stack up financially. So if there wasn't enough residential accommodation to make that work. So the other absolute crucial part of the brief was to get enough flats onto that site.
Yeah.
Like as much as possible, because the more we got on, the more would also be available for the church.
Yeah.
And it was, at the moment it's 3 stories of community use that is funded by 4 stories of residential, and actually that one of those stories includes a large 4-bedroom vicarage that belongs to the church again. So it's actually 3.5 and 3.5 stories, and that's actually quite challenging to make work.
Yeah.
So that was another, and that was one of the ways. That was basically how we got the job as well, because Richard knew the developer, and she had sort of been talking about how she'd done some previous studies, and it just had never really stacked up, and there hadn't been enough accommodation, and they'd gone for a pre-app and didn't like it. Planners didn't like it, so we had a quick look at it and managed to get quite a few more flats into it, and it looked like it would be something that might be acceptable on planning terms. that's how we got the job as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea, the model of the church with this kind of like this sacred space, this lovely elegant window, a great roof, nice piece of Gothic. Do love a bit of Gothic.
I mean, it's the actual church space doesn't actually even have a cross in it, but it references all of these church elements, and that allows it to be used for all sorts of different functions without that being an issue. At the same time, it is a church and it is a worship space, and the church windows are. We worked with Coralie Bickford Smith, who's an artist that does a lot of illustration and sort of graphic artwork.
Mm-hmm.
And so the church windows are actually she developed those and developed that pattern that sort of slowly fades up, and it works really well with the sort of shadows of trees coming through as well. It's very much that central space is also, it's physically in the center of the building, and it allows the basement community spaces, which would otherwise, if it didn't, have to have that double height space, and without that double height space, they would work far less well, because it wouldn't have, with this double height space that brings lots of daylight down, and you've got a low space under the church, and then you've got this double height space, and together that works, that sort of contrast works. And we were limited in how far we could go down for all sorts of reasons, and also efficiency of how we were using the basement walls of the existing building and whatnot. So it was really an exercise of balancing all these different things and making it a very spatially efficient building, overlaying all these different uses, and at the same time providing, sort of making that work with the spatial qualities. So having that contrast, having different types of spaces, having that double height space next to a quite low single height space, that balances and makes that work again. That was, and to come to those solutions, it was quite a, this is not something that just sort of happens. This is something you work through again and again and again.
Yeah.
This is not
I can imagine. Yes, I mean, that's a really nice description. I mean, it's just very quite interesting listening to you talk about the kind of, the practical, the way that I suppose design thinking leavens the dough of the economic spatial realities of architecture. And I just think it's something we don't encounter much in architectural education, but you don't encounter it much when you're reading stuff about architectural theory either, which tends, as we, when we started talking, tends towards this kind of very highfalutin, kind of very, I suppose, unreal might be a reasonable word to use about the way that we teach architecture. But we've got about 5 minutes left before this blasted program shuts us out again. I just wanted to hear your reflections on, or perhaps some thoughts on, what you see as your role as a younger practice. You were, until quite recently, officially a young practice, but we're not sure what the cutoff point. I
mean, I'm 40. I'm not. I don't feel like it's sort of. I'm middle-aged. I mean, I'm middle-aged with a kid. I mean, it's like I don't feel like my life is the opposite of rock and roll.
No, but architecture's got a slow maturation, hasn't it? It's got a very, very slow maturation. We are a long gestation. So I mean, what do you see as, I suppose, the role of your practice? I mean, obviously, as you say, it's to produce buildings, and it's to pay you a salary to do work.
I think, and I think that's
but
in a way
in relation to the broader profession. Like I'm kind of interested in the way that maybe this is not something that normal people think about, but I'm kind of interested in the way that younger practices are like, so you're a practice in London. London is this vast machine, and there's big architects and big developers that do big things. And then there's medium-sized, and they do medium-sized things. And then there's smaller practices like your own. And I'm kind of and most of the practices are small. Most architectural practices are small practices, or SMEs anyway. And I kind of just like, go on.
Sorry, no, but you're an SME until you're like, in architectural terms, you're huge, basically. I mean, you know, I just don't know the definition off by heart. It's like 50 employees or something. It's like, it's kind of, the definition is sort of like, like you have to be really big to not be an SME in architectural terms. So, but I don't know. I mean, it's I think there's a lot of wider responsibilities that the profession has and absolutely needs to deal with. And I don't think that's particularly if you're a sort of younger practice or an established practice or not. I think it's just things that absolutely need to be dealt with, and that are obviously sort of climate change potential, the impact of the construction industry and building, because that's just something that stares us all in the face. And every time you design something, you make decisions on that, and your decisions have consequences, or you hope that your decisions have consequences. I mean, there's a sort of discussion about how much work you do that never gets built, but that is in a way a consequence as well, because it means that something doesn't happen in a certain way, and that doesn't necessarily mean a saving. So that is something that is absolutely essential and has to be pushed forward. And the other issue is representation and diversity and gender balance. And to a certain extent, we try to do our best in sort of employment policies and support, and we try to not have stupid working hours and all of that kind of thing.
That was a question. That was a question I was going to ask. Have you managed to persist with the start at 9 and finish at 6 kind of?
Pretty much, yeah.
Have you?
Pretty much, yes. I mean, it's not always, but in a relatively consistent manner. So for example, I work 4 days a week, and I can't start before 9:30, 9:15, 9:30, and I can't finish much later than 6, simply because I've got to do stuff at home and pick up and bring to nursery and whatnot, and that's not going to change for the foreseeable future. So it's just and yes, of course, I mean, sometimes you finish stuff off, or you have to, and sometimes it also means, that means that it's difficult sometimes economically. It's difficult to get people to sort of pay for the amount of work that you do or you want to do on a job to do it well, and to balance that.
I mean, what could the industry do? So if the RIBA or the ARB could make a change that would make, so these issues around, I think, inclusion are very important. The issue particularly of female representation within practice, for one, amongst many other sort of issues that architecture faces. What would be the thing that we would want to see changed?
And the thing I want to see change is that it's everyone's responsibility. It's not mine as a woman to constantly talk about it, or remind people, or push people, or be an example, or be heard and say important things. First of all, I want to be able to say stupid things without anyone raising an eyebrow, because that's what happens with men generally.
They raise an eyebrow?
No, but you know what I mean? It's that sort of thing where, it's important that you're listened to in meetings and you've got important things to say and all of that. But I think actually I might, every now and then, I might say something that is completely idiotic, but I want that to be taken as important as it would do if a man said something idiotic. Like, why do you have to live to a sort of higher standard? I mean, and I think men need to step up. I mean, absolutely need to step up. I mean, you look at the amount of time that men take out for childcare and whatnot, and it just there is shared parental leave, and people don't take it. It's just like just do men need to just do their bit as well, and not being an ally or whatever, it's an active thing. It's not just a not standing in the way of, it's actually actively supporting equality and also diversity. So it's just a sort of more being aware of that. I think I'd really appreciate that if that was, if some of the policies were not so much about supporting women to step forward, but getting men to step up. Because I think...
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, yes.
Mini rant over.
No, not at all. I mean, I wrote down about a third of the way through, you were talking about planning, and you were talking about some of the various kind of ways that your architectural education has perhaps, and your architectural training hadn't perhaps prepared you for the kind of practice that is actually kind of common, is the way that architecture is done. It's the way that cities get built. It's the way buildings get built. And I come across a phrase, a colleague of mine emailed me earlier today about demystifying architecture. And it seems to me that this is kind of something that, if I was to be annoying and try and sum up what we've spoken about, there's a sense, isn't there, that what architectural education or architectural training does is try and create this mystique around what we do. And what I heard you talking about when you're talking about the Bethnal Green Mission Church is actually something that sits in this real world, which is both mysterious insofar as it's philosophical and it's to do with aesthetics and people and liturgy and all of this kind of stuff, and history and culture and context and urban grain and lovely romantic things. But it's also this very kind of practical and everyday thing. And I kind of really like this idea of your practice perhaps being a kind of good example of a demystification, like good quality design sits somewhere between these two worlds of the abstract world of thought and the everyday reality of having to get as many flats on a site in Bethnal Green because, well, it's in E2 for crying out loud. It's got to be big.
It sits on a tube station. It's like, yeah. But I think that's where good architecture happens, because like you have to get so many different things together, and it's difficult to get things built, and and at the moment probably even more so than ever, because someone has to pay for these things, and it's that's not getting any better. So it's I think you're right. I think there is that, I'm very honored to sort of that you think that we managed to do some of that, but I do think it's just not, architecture is so in a vast majority, it's not about sitting by yourself somewhere drawing the same thing again and again and again. It's just that's absolutely not. And if you're doing that is actually really not good for your architectural practice, because it doesn't get you forward. It doesn't get you along this road to actually making something reality. I don't think so. Yeah. So,
sounds good.
I guess that's it.
Thank you ever so much, Steph. I've very much enjoyed speaking to you. I found it very interesting, very engaging. Well,
thank you very much for sort of inviting me to join you on this chat. I really enjoyed it, and
it's funny to get people to reflect on their practice. Is one of the things that I've wanted to do, is get people to reflect on their practice, not because of some kind of perverse desire of mine, but I think that practitioners are kind of like the forgotten theorists. You kind of get theorist practitioners like Rem Koolhaas and people like that, and they're held up in great esteem. Danny Libeskind. But it's I and then you get theorists, and they just theorize. And then I think there's a lot of meat in talking to practitioners, particularly young practitioners like yourself. Because if you
there it is again.
yeah, if you're not young, then I'm really old. Really nice to talk to you.
Same here. Good to see you. Thank you for having me. And anytime.
Well, I thought that was very joyful. Thank you hugely to Stefanie for her input and for being so willing to tell her story. Please check out the podcast descriptions for links to her practice, Rhodes, and her professional links. And don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share. A is for Architecture. Lots and lots and lots. Cheers.